Great, thank you so much, Amanda. We're really excited for our analysis today. Thank you all for taking the time to join our webinar. The infrastructure framework, what's going on in Congress and out of the White House is very exciting. And so we jumped at the opportunity to take a look at this in the context of our models. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. We'll just a quick agenda for the day. We'll introduce the company, kind of tell you a little bit more about what REMI does and kind of the functionality of the models. Jim will give us some background on what's going on in the policy world right now as it relates to infrastructure. We'll do a live demo, we'll pull out some results and conclude a few key results and have time for Q&A at the end. All right, so REMI is in the business of improving public policy. That's really why we exist. That's really what gets us up in the morning. We do that by enabling and equipping policymakers with a series of models, and that gives them the opportunity to test the impacts, short-run and long-run impacts of the policies that they're considering before they're implemented. And that's, I think, a key philosophy that drives our organization. To the extent that policymakers can see the unique linkages between economic sectors and economic regions with these unique policy ideas, then very important details are learned, and that helps to hone in the policymaking process. And so we feel very importantly about that. We're able to do this by enabling this model to be available to people in a lot of different economic sectors. Guyesha, if you wouldn't mind hopping to the next slide. We'll just give you a quick snapshot of some of the clients that we've worked with, that we are working with, and that we've worked with in the recent past. You can see we run the gambit of private and public organizations that focus on a federal lens, those that look more like a local lens. And so we're really proud of the work that our clients are able to do with our model and the way that we're able to benefit and support their work. Great, now I'll hand it over to Jim, and he'll give us some information about where the infrastructure policies are looking at.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. So really what this all stems from in terms of the background to these policies are the two plans that Joe Biden released in March of this year, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. In total, the two of them contain over $4 trillion in spending and are targeted at improving both hard and human infrastructure, as well as improving social services and workforce development efforts that either are currently underway and the administration believes should have more funding, or those that do not yet exist. So that sort of turned into two things as the legislative process moved forward, and Biden's administration attempted to turn these plans into legislative reality. So first off, there's the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, which was announced in June of this year. It contains $579 billion in new spending. That's, you'll hear other numbers thrown around between 900 billion and 1.2 trillion. Those include baseline spending. So the stuff we're going to hone in on today is just the 579 billion that's new and not included in projected spending for future fiscal years. And this is really the result of some negotiations between both moderate Democrats and some Republican senators. And it focuses on hard infrastructure, which means, road and rail, broadband, electrical, that sort of stuff that everybody, across party lines agrees is in quote unquote infrastructure. And then what was split off from this is the reconciliation measure, which is something that the Democrats want to pass purely along party lines. I mean, I'm sure they'd be glad if any Republicans came along to support it, but that isn't perceived as likely by operators on either side of the aisle. And it's really designed to include most, if not all, of the stuff that was lost in the American Jobs Plan and Families Plan when those transitioned into the bipartisan framework, and they would just pass this along to get the rest of our priorities signed into law. And it's 3.5 trillion in new spending above baseline levels. All right, so here I'm going to talk you through a few of the key goals of this deal, both the bipartisan and reconciliation components. First off, there's the workforce development component, which is just, it's more emphasized in the reconciliation measure. It's meant to create high quality jobs that pay prevailing wages and ensure workers' right to organize, as well as create a workforce that is well suited to the labor demand situation that exists now and is estimated to exist in the future. Also, it's meant to rebuild the competitive advantage of the United States in supply chains, R&D, and workforce qualifications for jobs that currently are in demand and maybe in demand in the future. Also, obviously, there is the core desire to improve infrastructure. It's meant to both fix existing infrastructure and improve that infrastructure, as well as add new infrastructure to our stock of both transit and electric plus broadband. And there's the last but not least is the idea of just incentivizing job creation. And that's meant to bring a lot of jobs, particularly in sort of transit and sort of like in the transportation industry and in the manufacturing industry back, back within U.S. shores. That's done through a series of programs that are within the reconciliation measure that are designed to incentivize manufacturing jobs, and also obviously investing a lot in new transportation capabilities. All right, so yeah, let's just go through here. We're going to talk about both a live demo of the model, and we're going to walk you through the variables we use to model both of the policies, and talk you through the results of our models for both of the scenarios, that being the bipartisan infrastructure framework alone and the reconciliation measure plus the bipartisan infrastructure framework. All right, so here's the model overview for the bipartisan infrastructure framework. That is going to be broken out into three categories, which is future spending. That's $578 billion. There's a little bit of funding that we couldn't figure out how to model exactly right, so it's only $1 billion less than the actual proposal, and it's spread over 5 years per the language used on the White House website. And that's just broken out into various variables to represent the line items that we found in the proposal. Then there's also another category of modeling variables, which are long-run benefits, which are just sort of modeling the improvements to the economy that will result from this infrastructure investment. There's improvements to labor access and commodity access. Those are our big ones. That's because firms with all this new infrastructure will be better equipped to bring the best workers and the best input goods to their locations and utilize them efficiently with all this new infrastructure. And also there's a little extra something, which is some improvements to labor productivity in a few key industries that result from the broadband investments that exist in the bipartisan framework. And those are just concentrated on industries that are heavily integrated with digital technology, sort of like IT services, scientific services, and financial industry type stuff. And there's some costs associated with this too. We modeled two things here. One, there's a Biden proposal to increase the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. And that's an increase of 7 percentage points, of course. And there's a short run individual income tax increase that we modeled as paying for the spending dollar for dollar, but that expires after the 5 years of spending. So here's a quick overview for the reconciliation proposal. We have obviously the future spending as $3.914 trillion in modeled spending, and it's spread over 5 years just to provide a apples to apples comparison with the bipartisan framework. And obviously it's just a lot more spending, but it's modeled in the exact same way, and it's going to have similar but just larger direct stimulative effects on the economy. And there's also the long run benefits, which are similar again. There's improvements to labor and commodity access, and those are going to be a bit larger than in the BIF, obviously, because there's just more spending for infrastructure in this one. You're going to see bigger improvements. And as well, there are additional increases to labor productivity in specific industries, as well as decreases in consumer prices for specific industries because of various programs that either incentivize workforce development and training, or that subsidize certain categories of goods that the policymakers in this case perceived as essential to, the stability of families. And our pay for categories here are now even larger. Obviously, the benefits are going to be bigger, but so are the costs. We have a wealth tax that was proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren. This isn't officially in the proposal, but we thought it was an interesting way to pay for it, and it would give us some good results. And it's purported to generate $300 billion per year in revenue, and we modeled that as a reduction in demand for certain types of financial services that are predominantly used by wealthy individuals to invest and grow their personal savings. And we also, for those costs, modeled an increase in the cost of capital, because obviously if there's less invested money in both the sort of debt finance and equity finance systems, it's going to be more expensive to finance investment spending in capital goods, both on the equity and debt side. And there's also the same corporate tax rate increase that Biden proposed. We kept that in both scenarios. But just to be clear, the individual income tax increase that pays dollar for dollar isn't included in this scenario, because the wealth tax proposal more than makes up for it. All right, so here we're going to talk you through the Transite model.
Yeah, so this Transite model was a core feature of our methodology, because in Transite it allows for organizations to understand how transportation will increase their economic competitiveness. So what the Transite model does is that it uses multivariate analysis and as well as household demographics in order to give regions and as well as in order to give regions a peek into upcoming their upcoming like income shifts, as well as to target areas that may be right for economic development, and lastly to forecast into growing populations. And so with that, we're going to do a quick model demo of our model. And so just going to go straight into it. And also I do want to tell you all is that this is going to be a very brief overview, just to give you a preview into the REMI model, and also to take a sneak peek of our variables. So when you come into any of our suite of products, you're going to be immediately greeted with this nicely tiled layout, and it's going to go by tiers. So down here, you're going to find the regional as well as national forecast, which is going to have your baseline data. So this data is sourced from the Congressional Budget Office, as well as the BLS, BEA, Michigan's like RSQE, and a host of other sources. The next, and then the next step of this process is going to be your new regional as well as national controls. And then so what this allows you to do is to have some user calibration. So this allows for you to hone in on the precision of your results by implementing macro and as well as micro effects in which they may not be captured by your baseline data. Because REMI, because here at REMI, I do want to stress that we take a top-down, bottom-up approach. And then, like, although we update our models frequently, however, we can only update them as much as so that we can only update them as much as our sources do. So with that being said, this just gives you more functionality in order to manipulate your population, and as well as to capture some variables that may not have been capturing your baseline. And then the last part of this particular, second to the last part of this is going to be your options for your regional or national simulation. And also a key feature of this model is the economic geography, which allows you to see inside of your regions and as well as to understand what exactly is going on. So for example, in this particular region, this features our 8 region BEA national model with 160 sectors. And so with these models, you can either get as granular or as broad as you want. And yeah, and then I know for the industry sectors, we usually go by either 2370 or 160. So, but for today's particular simulation, we're just gonna dive right into our infrastructure results. And so before you get a preview into the inputs list, anytime in which that you open a REMI model, you're going to be greeted with this page, which gives you some directionality on how to use the variables, and as well as to understand the economics behind the model. But as far as today's simulation, as you all can see, is that since the infrastructure bill was so large, this is heavily reflected by our model. So, with this particular with this particular part of the methodology, we're not going to get too in the weeds, but I did want to give you all a preview into what's going on, and also the type of functionality in which that you have to forecast your simulations. So, for example, we have the category for detailed investment, and as well as you can get deeper with your detail by choosing the particular industry, as well as region, and then the units denominations. And then so you may be asking, why are the numbers spread like this? Well, it's primarily because with the appropriations of the bill, they didn't specify, so therefore we decided to spread the numbers as best as we could. And so without further ado, we'll hop right into the results. And then so with all of our models, you're going to be presented with the key results, which is going to feature the economic summary and as well as a host of other details. However, I did want to highlight some of the key features of Transite, which is going to give you a transportation summary about how either this helped or possibly hurt your regions. And then so with the Transite model, you have the ability to not only view the relevant economic results as it relates to transportation, but you also have the functionality to create a benefits cost analysis, which comes into play when states and as well as regions have access to their vehicle miles travel and as well as vehicles their vehicles hours travel and as well as their vehicles miles travel data. And so as far as the results here, you get a chance to view your results as either a table, or you can view them as as a graph. So just to give you all a preview, like we have the ability to see how this has affected our population over time, and as well as other variables such as our resident adjusted employment. But but as I said, with these particular results, we didn't want to get too in the weeds here because Jim is actually going to explain to us some of our most notable results from this analysis. But this right here was like a very brief overview of Transite. So, and then now I'll pass it over to Jim.
All right, so yeah, we're going to take a quick look at GDP results first. As you can see, there's a big elevation in GDP versus the control in the reconciliation case. That's just because there's a lot of spending going into the economy. Obviously, about $4 trillion is going to have a big effect. And then you see it comes crashing back down after that sugar high. That's just because like all the spending's leaving, and also some of the negative effects of the capital cost and wealth tax are being felt. And as all those labor productivity, commodity access, and labor access effects are being more strongly felt, you see strong improvement, and then it sort of levels off at an improvement over baseline that's higher than the bipartisan framework by a significant margin. But it's worth mentioning that it's actually not like as many times higher as as much more spending is included in this versus the bipartisan framework, if that makes any sense. The bipartisan framework is a lot less sort of uneven here. You see it just steadily improves after the spending kicks in, and you see a steady elevation in GDP above the baseline levels for the whole period. All right, so here we see our price levels, and this is a rather interesting part of our results. You see small upticks in both cases, which is on account of the increased spending, and in the reconciliation measures case, the increased capital costs, but these come down and they stay down in the long run because of the reduced cost of production on account of increased commodity access and labor access, and in especially the reconciliation bills case. But in both cases, there's a substantial improvement in labor productivity too. And you can see the change in output versus baseline in all sort of an average over the period for all sectors. All industries see a pretty notable one, at least 1 to 2%. But again, it's worth noting that the improvement on average isn't proportional to the increase in spending when you're looking at the reconciliation versus the bipartisan framework. Some other interesting results here is that natural resources actually take a small hit versus the baseline and reconciliation. That's just because of the big increases in capital costs that we're seeing from the wealth tax. And as resources in extractive industries in the US are fairly capital intensive, think oil and gas, metals and mining, that sort of stuff. They're very capital intensive industries. So increasing the cost of capital is definitely going to negatively affect them a lot. And you can see construction and manufacturing do very well. Construction, you see this big improvement. Honestly, that a lot of that's concentrated in the early years, but it's doing because there's a lot of building of the infrastructure, but it does very well. And manufacturing does pretty well throughout the whole period. And you can see that finance, insurance, and real estate, just because the whole economy is doing a bit better relative to the baseline in the BIF scenario, you see it's a little bit above baseline results, but in the reconciliation measure, you can see it actually is lower than the baseline results, and that's on account of the wealth tax and its effect on the demand for those sort of services. All right, we can see this by region. All regions see a respectable increase. In the aggregate, honestly, the reconciliation isn't much of an improvement. In the Great Lakes Plains, Southeast and Rocky Mountain Far West, which is honestly a lot of the country, there is a substantial difference. But you can see in New England, the improvement is actually less pronounced under reconciliation than under the BIF scenario. And that's just because, there's a lot of finance activity in Boston, and Connecticut is one of the nation's leading centers in the insurance industry. So when those take a hit, that region's going to see a bit of negative results. But overall, they're both above the baseline. In the Mideast, actually, the reconciliation measure makes the region worse off than under the baseline scenario, and that's because, again, New York is in the Mideast region, and it is the world center of finance. And if finance takes a big hit, New York is going to take a big hit, and New York is the biggest population center in the Mideast region. And you can see the Southwest region both do about the same, and that's because while some things are doing better off under reconciliation than they would under BIF, the increase in capital cost is just hurting that performance in the natural resources sector, and you're just seeing roughly even results with BIF versus reconciliation. All right, so here's Zachary to take us through our conclusions.
Great, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Guyesha. I'm here to just tie a little bow on the analysis that Jim and Guyesha have provided for us. I'll just pull a few key points together. I think very interesting from a perspective of GDP, it looks like the reconciliation has a little bit of volatility with the way that GDP rises very high and then crashes down for a small period, and then in the long run settles on a much higher status quo than under the BIF proposal. Now that's partially a result of the way we've modeled the Senator Warren tax and how that impacts financial services. It's also, of course, a result of the higher ticket value of the reconciliation plan. So as more details come out, as more details come from Congress and the White House as to exactly how much is going to be spent, the years that it's going to be spent, and the way it's going to be paid for, that change in GDP might shift a little bit, but I think the core tenets of the analysis that we provide are still good. That while spending is occurring, you will see a very high level of GDP growth above the baseline. After that spending dries up, you might have a period where GDP drops either back to or below a normal, but then as the improvements in education and in those human capital related expenditures start to improve the workforce, in the long run, you will see a more productive economy. On the inflation side, on the price level side, again, very interesting analysis. We have modest short-run increases in inflation, and that's to be expected when the government spends a lot of money, especially under the reconciliation measure. Then you'll see higher levels of inflation, higher price levels. But long term, in both scenarios, you see quite a significant gain in price levels in the sense that they are lower than the baseline. And that's because as commodities become easier to access, as laborers are able to find work better, as the factors of production become less expensive after infrastructure investments, then there are savings across the board and prices come down. And essentially, this is, perhaps one of the core reasons why we invest in infrastructure in the first place, is to provide a more efficient economy and to make the nuts and bolts of production more accessible and cheaper to attain. Employment is a very interesting picture. Again, the losses that we see in the finance industry are tied to the way we've modeled the Senator Warren wealth tax. And so as details come out on how this plan will be paid for, then that might shift a little bit, but I think it is important to understand that the taxes that the tax proposals that are out there will have certain impacts on the economy, and those will affect certain regions. So if in fact a wealth tax is a part of this proposal, then I don't think it's outlandish to claim that certain sectors of the economy, the finance sector, will take a big hit as savings is utilized in a different way, and as more of those higher earner savings go to tax funds, and that will impact the finance industry, and therefore probably impact the Mideast more than it might other regions. But across the board, we do see rather healthy gains in both scenarios, both throughout the country. And then lastly, in terms of output, we do see those significant gains in construction and manufacturing. It's interesting to note that the gains in construction, as Jim mentioned, are concentrated in that time period where the government is spending. That construction gain is when roads are being built and ports are being dug. But afterwards, those employment gains in construction more or less dry up. In the long run, though, manufacturing, retail, and wholesale in particular, but several other sectors as well, see significant increases in output, and that's because factors of production are now cheaper and more readily available. And then lastly, I'll just mention that you do see that loss in financial services, and what the model is showing is not only the loss in jobs in that sector specifically, but whatever industries are then tied to that finance sector in the New York region. All right. So why does all of this matter? Why do we hold this webinar? Why do we take a look at how infrastructure spending will impact the economy? The simple reason is there's a lot of unknowns with the future, and especially with these infrastructure bills coming out. The specific way in which money is spent and which programs get funded will have a big impact on the way that people buy and sell goods. So the purpose of the model is to clarify how minute changes in policy might impact real-world outcomes. And not only does it help to clarify those changes, but it helps the user predict where those changes might occur. And lastly, this is a tool that can be used to inform stakeholders and policyholders as these plans are being developed. And so as the infrastructure plans change and shift in the fast-paced world of politics in DC, then it's important to have a tool like the REMI models in order to be able to understand how certain changes might impact your either constituents or your neck of the woods of the economy. So that's why we feel this is so important, not only to analyze these policies, but to have tools like the REMI models to take a look.